So if I can introduce them to you all, and you met Cynthia just then. So Cynthia is the Telstra Group Managing Director, as you told us, of Strategic Finance, 2012 National Private and Corporate Sector Award winner, and the Chief Executive for Barclays in Australia and New Zealand. So thank you very much, Cynthia, for introducing us. Elizabeth Broderick, I'm sure you all know Elizabeth, Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner. Elizabeth was named Telstra New South Wales Businesswoman of the Year back in 2001, and when she was a lawyer at Blake Dawson Waldron. So thank you very much, Elizabeth. Next we have gorgeous Jodie Fox in the centre. Now Jodie's the co-founder and Chief Creative Officer at Shoes of Prey, hence we're all checking out her shoes a little bit earlier. Jodie was awarded the National Private and Corporate Sector Award in 2011. I'm sure you get sick of talking about shoes everywhere you go, but seriously, those are the things that really matter, absolutely. RHONDA BRIGHTON-HALL. RHONDA is the Executive General Manager, Organisational Development of the Commonwealth Bank, and RHONDA was the New South Wales Private and Corporate Sector Award winner in 2009, and she was Senior Vice President of Human Resources and Communications at Luxottica. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Did.
Great. That's a good that's a good start. And Louise HERRON next to me, the CEO of the Sydney Opera House. Louise was an inaugural winner at the National Awards in 1995 when she was a senior partner at Mint Ellison. So thank you, ladies. Now what we're going to do is have a little bit of a chat here together, and then when the panel discussion is over, I'll open it up to the floor, and I'd love to hear some questions from you. So scribble them down as you go. And also if you want to participate in the conversation online, as always, there's a hashtag. It's Telstra Biz Women, so obviously BIZ in the centre. So we're talking about 20 years since the awards began. So that takes us back to 1995. I did a quick little bit of research. Batman Forever was the highest grossing movie. Wasn't that brilliant? Not. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty. The internet first entered public consciousness. Isn't that amazing? It's only 20 years. The DVD was introduced. Clearly I did a lot of research here, and the iPhone was still 12 years away. So I think we want to start by talking about where we were 20 years ago. And the first question I think today is how we've changed, how business has changed for the better for women in this country. So the things that have improved, the things that have made a difference. Elizabeth, if I could start with you, probably I guess a nice overview, if that's not too big a question to ask, on how you think things have got better in that 20-year time frame.
Yeah, and they definitely have got better. Just to give you a bit of a sense of it, 1.6 million new female entrants into the labour market here in Australia. So we've really seen women stepping up more in terms of paid work, which goes to their economic security. So that's been a real positive. We've seen women can do anything in Australia. Now, there's no job that isn't open to them. And there I'm talking about the fact that we've had our first female Prime Minister, our first female head of state, even our first female head of military college, Duntroon, which is very much a male-dominated institution. And of course, women are open, all roles in the military are also open to women now. So we've seen that. We've seen a doubling of the number of women on boards here in Australia. And you know, given that we'd gone up, I think, 0.2% over a decade, what we've seen is that really accelerate over the last few years. So we've gone from 8 to 18%. I think we've seen we've seen the National Paid Parental Leave Scheme. That has been a real positive because for the first time we've seen work and home life. There's a recognition that what happens at home can also impact on work and vice versa. I suppose that when we get to talk about the flip side, the reality is that it's still women that are predominantly doing the caring work in Australia. But, you know, we've also seen issues like sexual harassment. So the rate of sexual harassment of women in workplaces has come down, still exists. And the gender pay gap has pretty much remained the same. So that's just kind of a quick overview of where we've come. I think, you know, sometimes I sit there and I think, oh my gosh, are we making any progress? It all seems so glacial. But when I look back over a 20-year period, and even if you were to look 30 years ago, when you got married, because of a Commonwealth marriage ban, most women had to leave the labour market. So you know what? We've come a long way in that period of time.
And yesterday, our first female assistant coach in the AFL.
Yeah, that was great to see that.
So another
Fantastic.
one. Jodie, can I ask you about starting up business? And I know clearly, because you're so young, that you weren't doing it 20 years ago, but from where you're standing now. So in 2012, 1 million women ran small businesses, 40% of them starting their business with less than $5,000. So do you think it is easier for women to do it now and to be in charge of of what they want to do, their own business?
Look, I certainly think that because of the work that's gone before us, that we now have the opportunity to make those choices and not think that there's anything that is beyond us. So I think there are certainly barriers that have fallen. That being said, there was a statistic released by it was actually printed in the New Yorker a little while ago, and unfortunately I couldn't find one about Australia, but it was saying that in the US, only 8% of funded startups have female co-founders or founders. And that to me was a really interesting barrier that we're facing now. So yes, there's the opportunity to start a business, yes, there's the right attitude and environment for that to happen, but can these women take their businesses further? And I think that recently I was actually, just this last Friday night, I was speaking to another female co-founder. She'd been to 50 meetings raising capital, and in those 50 meetings, she only met one female. So we're still seeing that very much as we start to take these businesses into medium-sized businesses and beyond. So while I think that, yes, there is that opportunity to start, we have a lot of work to do in pushing those businesses into being bigger entities.
Louise, why do you think women make good innovators and good entrepreneurs?
I think women have a good broad perspective on things, and they're always happy to look at things from lots and lots of different angles. I think a sort of a freer, more open mind in many situations. But I also think that women choose to be innovators because of their total situation. So that if you're in a standard workforce, if you're in a law firm, as Elizabeth and I were, or if you're in an investment bank, you think, I have to do it exactly their way, and I actually can't manage to have 2 children and a dog and go to do all the things that I need to do and stick to that narrow path. And so I think women say, you know what, I need to actually divert away for a little while and control my own destiny for a little while. Often, not everyone does, to control their own destiny, and that's why they use these innovative skills as a means of achieving that, so that they can combine everything that needs to be done.
Kind of forced to do so,
Forced
I
to
guess.
do so, yeah.
RHONDA, have you seen, I guess within big business too, there's hopefully been improvements, and probably big business has more room for flexibility than small business. Do you think we've seen big business lead the way at all in some of these changes and improvements?
I'm the consummate corporate girl because I've only worked in really big companies. So CBA is my smallest company. I think that I think that corporate Australia or corporate anywhere has probably played a leadership role in some things, but not as often as we should. But I think this social license to operate that we're starting to wrap our heads around now will see us play a much bigger role. I think that the flexibility that used to be a set of policies is now saying, if you want a really great workforce, you're going to have to be much more flexible than we've ever been before. Other things coming through research on the 100-year life means that careers that used to have 1 career peak will now have 3 or 4. Portfolio careers that used to be in your 50s will now be in your 20s. So we have to rethink how we approach every person that works for us, and it has to be individualised, and it has to be much more flexible and interesting to them, as opposed to us saying, this is our proposition, I hope you like it. And so I think we are starting to lead the way, but we've got a way to go.
I remember at one stage there was a few businesses, one came out, one big business, I can't remember the name, saying, you know, we're introducing such and such maternity leave conditions, and another one came out saying, but we're doing these fancy creches and all of these different things. It was almost like they were all trying to earn brownie points.
Yeah.
But I thought, who cares? Whatever their motivation is, as long as it is happening and they're acknowledging that changes need to be made. Cynthia, sorry. Yeah.
So I think there's one thing that is changing quite rapidly, and that's, it used to be quite overt. So when I first started, my first day at BHP, I was a PHP cadet, and the guy who was running my orientation just came up and said straight out, I'm so sorry they gave it to you because my son wanted that job and you'll just probably have kids. And I was like, you know, 25 years later I still have no witty comeback. But I would say I know that guy's now a real estate agent, so I'm glad BHP didn't invest in a
called
HR
the karma
degree
bus
for him.
I think your witty comeback is the career that you've had.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
But it's a good point, because the fact is, I mean, in terms of overt discrimination, well, and I'm talking maybe large businesses, but across organisations, we don't see it so much. It's not like people say, well, you can't have that job because you're a woman or whatever. What we're seeing now is gender asbestos. It's built into the walls, the floors, the ceilings, the structures and practices of organisations. And I think that makes it even more difficult, because you can't touch it. You know there's something there that is reproducing disadvantage for a particular group, and that's often women, and particularly women with caring responsibilities. But it is more difficult to name. And therefore, I think it's more difficult to do something about it. That's what's changed.
Yeah, but one comment that I would make, though, just back on the discussion around flexibility, is that you're absolutely right. So what we need to do is just change the perspective that we have on things. So at Telstra, we announced a concept called All Roles Flex, which starts from the point of view of saying 100% of roles are flexible. So you need to actually tell me why it can't be flexible, which regardless of whether you're male or female, it's just a different approach to the problem. So if we get more men looking at flexibility in their roles, and I think they will be phenomenal role models for women as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And is that the way to get rid of any resentment that might ever occur? Because there is that when, you know, particularly if you're a mother, and people that don't have kids can often look upon colleagues and say, well, why are they getting, you know, flexibility and I don't?
Well, it's resentment, but I think it's also a stigma. But the point that I'd make is we all have caring, or often we all have caring responsibilities. In some instances that's for children, in some instances that might be for elderly parents. And the more that it's the whole population who's taking responsibility for caring, and the more men who take responsibility particularly for caring for children, then I think the better it's going to be for everyone in society.
What has not changed to allow women to make differences? And Rhonda, if I can ask you this, the gender pay gap, will that ever improve?
Oh, I get emotional about that. So I just find that it has to improve. I mean, it's just totally not okay. And I think big corporations is probably the easiest place to fix it, but we don't. And we still have a way to go in that. I mean, every year you look at your pay, and if there is a gap between people doing the same job, it needs to be rectified. And it needs to be absolute. And I think the fact that as a society we put up with that is quite extraordinary. Now, I understand there's a whole bunch of social issues behind it, and the way that we build pay and tenure and a whole bunch of reasons, but sooner or later we have to stare that one in the eye and not be okay with it.
Some countries in the world, they advertise men and women's pay for at least a month a year in the reception area, so that when you walk in you can see there how big the pay differential is. And it comes back to transparency. I think that's the first step, is making pay transparent.
And I think we've had 30 years or more to fix it, so exposure is an excellent policy.
Louise?
Actually, I really want to ask Elizabeth a question, if I can, which is about gender asbestos. So
That's the best term.
It's such a great term. So one of the situations that I think probably we've all been in is a situation where you think, you know, this has been the most sexist thing that has just happened to me, and yet I can't talk about it. Because if I do, it's going to look like I'm weak, or it's going to look like I'm playing the gender card. And so we have this constant thing that we're trying to change things, and at the same time we don't want to do it so that it too much reflects on us individually as being weak or not being prepared to stand up for it.
You're absolutely right, and that's about stepping outside your gender boundary. So when we have a view about how women should be, not just in society but also in the workplace, and if you step up and say, you know what happened then was just not okay, you're really taking a more aggressive stance, which is stepping outside your gender boundary. Therefore you will be penalised for doing that. And one of the ways we try to work around that is to inspire bystanders to actually come in. So that might be the man who's also part of a conversation who says, look, actually the way we talk to women is not like that in this organisation or whatever. But we know bystanders will only act when they feel that they won't be victimised for saying something, that action will be taken, and that they work in an organisation that cares about these things. So those three conditions have to exist first. But you're absolutely spot on, Louise.
And who spearheads that? Do you think it needs to be women, or do you think it needs to be men?
My view is absolutely men and women. I mean, this is not a women's issue. This is all our issue, and that's one of the fabulous things I think we've seen in the last 2 years, is men stepping up beside women, saying, actually, this is all our issue. Gender equality benefits all of us. And actually, when we step up beside each other and create change, drive systemic change in all aspects of Australian society and in organisations, that's when we'll step forward together and we'll all benefit through that. And I think that's been a real shift in the last couple of years.
Absolutely. I mean, I find myself, I have at Shoes of Prey, we have the opportunity to create, we have no legacy. So we can create the environment that we would like this to be for women. And we've done that. Our HR person, Lydia Milligan's in the room, and she created our maternity policy for our very first 2 Shoes of Prey babies this year, which was really exciting. But I find that even myself and even how much I believe in all of these things, that I too perpetuate these same biases. And it's such a thing to be cautious of. And I've thought about this a lot, and I'd propose that potentially it's because we weren't present when business structures were being formed. It was built by men for men, and that's nobody's fault. It's simply how it was. And there's so much that's just so unnatural to a woman, and we're starting to step into that environment, and these changes, we're not sure well where they'll end up. And in fact, one of the just 2 days ago, there was a great article published in Forbes by Susan Adams, and she posed a question that I still can't answer, which is, once we reach this parity of roles in the workplace, what does parity actually look like? If both parents, for example, are equally successful in their work environment, what happens to the family structure? And I think as a society, that's something that affects all of us, and we must rise together to look at and try and solve.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, but I think that I agree with you completely. This is a societal question that we're trying to answer, and so my vision for what that would look like is that both parents take responsibility equally for caring for the children. That it's not that the default is not that it's the woman. Now, it might be that the woman chooses that that's what she wants to do, but equally the man might choose that that's what he wants to do, and that is in a society context that's equally acceptable. But I think we're miles away from that at the moment, I should say.
Because that's a trouble for men and women to make true choices around who works and who cares requires men and women to be paid equally, because at the minute those choices are in a sense made for you. If you've got a high earning man and a lower earning woman, which is the normal in Australia, then who cares and who works is almost already made. The man will work because the family will get more money and the woman will care. So I think you're right, we need to change societal structures, social norms. For example, the ideal mother belief. That is, if you're educated and born in Australia, you fundamentally believe that good mothers are always with their children. Now, they can be drinking, gambling, smoking, doesn't really matter. If you're with your kids, you are a good mother, and we know it's much more nuanced than that. So these are the social norms that have to change to allow that true choice.
But this is where I go to the point of role models. So the more we can have senior experienced men taking career breaks for 6 months or 12 months to take some of the caring responsibility, and then them having to come back to work, then that sets a fantastic example for men and women going forward.
Also a generational thing. Do you think it's changing? I hope that we're raising young men who recognise the importance of the roles and as opposed to God bless her, but my beautiful Italian mother-in-law, who has a very different view than women of my generation. I think hopefully that... Louise,
my sons are grown up. They're 21 and 24. So they've sort of been through all of this and through quite a lot of change. And the 24-year-old said to me a couple of years, Mum, he's a really great guy. And I've noticed that amongst my friends, the guys whose mothers work are much more interesting and much more open. And I thought, yes, that is fantastic. That is great. And the other thing I sort of wanted to say is we talk about society and societal structures. One of the, in our team at the Opera House, we have just as many female executives as we do male executives, and we joke about that because it's only the women who are prepared to accept the pay in the arts. But I think also one of the things that I spend a lot of time with my senior female executives on, and the women below them, and just thinking about it generally, is that women basically want to be good. And girls want to be good. They want to be good girls. We want to do the right job. And so we tend to often, within an organisation, stick to quite a tight role, to quite a well-defined role. So you'll see women doing, they'll be lawyers, or they'll do marketing, or they'll do HR, but actually breaking out into broad business roles where you take responsibility for a broad range of things, I think is less common in women, because we want to feel that we're good. We want to feel that we're doing the right job and that people are going to praise us for doing the right job. And that's not, in my experience, how blokes work. Blokes want to be more exploratory, and they're happy to just put it out there, 3 out of 10's fine. I got 3 things really good, whereas we're not prepared to do that.
But how do we make that balance? Because I can't do what I do without the support of my husband. He helps me run the house, I help him run the house. you know, he's got his skills, he's so much tidier and a way better cook than I am, you know, but I take the kids for vaccinations and, you know, blah, blah, and all the jobs I've got to do. How do we find that balance without ever, you know, making one gender, one role, one more important than the other? How do we make sure we bring what we all as unique individuals, male and female, to the party?
I actually think it's about education. I mean, if we want to have a truly gender equal society, we need to be starting to help kids understand from age 5 onwards about what that could look like. Because the reality is, from the minute we put our feet on the ground and we look around, what's mum doing, what's dad doing, who's teaching, who's caring, who holds power, who doesn't, we build a deeply held belief system, which is called our gender schema. We all have it, men and women. And all the research suggests that actually that's formed very early on. And then you go out into the world, you experience things, and your gender schema just gets more and more tightly held. So we need to impact at that point, and that's why I think the work that's happening around the school curriculum to build gender equality in from kindergarten upwards will be very important work in doing that. Because I do think in this discussion we don't in any way want to minimise the importance of caring. I mean, I know from my own perspective, the caring work I do every day is the most important work I do. It's the ultimate expression of our humanity, caring. So it's not about devaluing motherhood or being a parent or anything at all. It's actually about saying that both caring and paid work matters. And we need to make those two things sit together.
So
both
can I
men
ask
and
both
women.
Cynthia and Rhonda then, throwing a cat amongst the pigeons here, do you think there are simply less women than men who want those big roles?
No, absolutely not. No, and sorry, absolutely not. I feel that a big part of what we need to solve for here is a framework to let people make the choices that they want to make. So I completely agree with what you said, Liz. But unless we have, you know, we can go back to tax-deductible childcare or available childcare that gives people flexibility around the choices that they make, male and female, about whether they work or whether they care, and at what points in their life they make those choices as well, because it is a cycle and it will change depending on the age of your children or you know, the age of your parents if you've got elderly parents. But unless we have a framework that actually lets people make those decisions, then what ends up happening, as we've all said, is that women don't choose to stop working. They don't have a choice. They have to opt out of working.
Rhonda?
I think I like the idea that it comes into not just the way society's set up, but also in the way we set up relationships. And it's I don't want to be hokey about it, but when you get all the Telstra women together with their partners, male and female, it's very interesting to see that it isn't a competition. And so you'll find very healthy egos. You know, men and women who are supporting very successful careers of other women are very comfortable in their own space. They're not battling to earn more or battling to be better, or it's just a really healthy, supportive partnership of equals often. And it's not based on income and it's not based on career success. It's just based on a relationship that works. And I think if we start to look at family structures as, have you got it working for you guys, however that might be, part-time, full-time, one or the other, both, whatever, awesome, good on you, as opposed to us saying, I think you should do this and you should do that. And I mean, from a personal perspective, I was lucky enough to marry a guy who grew up in a male family because his mother left and so dad did everything. I grew up in a family where my father died, so my mother did everything. So when we got together, it was a battle to do everything. We both thought that's what we did. So there's never been this point where I've said, I must do the vacuuming because that's my gender role. It's like, oh, we need to do the vacuuming. Which one job do you want? So it's, if you don't have that schema from very young, or both of us had that, we haven't then developed it in our daughters. And our daughters have a very similar reaction to working mums. They go, wonder what we'll do with our lives. It's not this gender role, which I agree with you. I think it's really strong and we need to break it. I don't know how to, but it's worth a try.
I think there was something really interesting that we're all sort of talking about in the value of care and that kind of emotional part of it. And I'd like to propose as well that that has enormous value in business. And I think that something that I think about quite frequently is shoes of prey and the way that we do business and the way that we bring these insights to share with women this opportunity to create something can only come from having that emotional intelligence and having that connection with ourselves to want to do something like that. And that has that very seed of an idea has turned into a multi-million-dollar business. So I think that also too in the business environment we need to value those insights, connection, caring, because it does have also this really high professional business value.
And that comes back to, I think, to the mix. I think it's so essential for so many companies, and we look at things differently. Men and women approach tasks differently and problems differently and all of those factors. And can I ask about too, women and mentoring and competitiveness? Because I wonder how many industries where there is true female mentoring without that fear that if you help someone, you know, they're after your job. Louise, have you?
I've never even thought of that.
Fantastic.
I don't actually know what you mean.
But there's sort of this perception that women don't necessarily support one another. They're the first to cut each other down.
No, that is a different thing. I do get what you're saying there. Are you actually supporting the other woman? Look, I think that has really changed. If I think back to 20 years ago or so, that was a thing. Am I fighting against another woman or am I fighting the field? I think definitely, maybe it's something to do with age as well, but I feel like I'm fighting the field, not the women.
Yeah, no, I found that certainly when I was in investment banking and I was involved in setting up a women's network globally. The only time in my career I've ever experienced that concept of a woman pulling the ladder up, as they say, was a woman said to me, you know, I don't want to be part of your women's network because no one helped me, so I'm not going to help anyone. And I just thought, God, that's so sad. But to be fair, she was an older woman and she's now retired. And I think it is generational because all I've seen since then is women absolutely wanting to help each other, and frankly, senior men wanting to help women succeed as well, both in terms of being mentors but also being sponsors, because I think sponsorship is equally as important.
Who else has found sort of, I guess, the mentoring? I'm amazed how many young girls now ask, which I think is wonderful. And I, as a, you know, in my field, I think it's a really important thing. And I try to help young women as much as possible, and even get emails from girls I don't know who are either studying journalism or want to, or, you know, there's a couple that I've emailed. We've had regular contact for many, many years, and every time they get a new achievement or they do something, they let me know. I feel like I've become another mum that they've got to ring and tell me, and I feel really proud, and I hate to sound selfish, but I kind of feel good about myself for doing it. So do you think that is something that, Rhonda, you've seen at all in business?
I think mentoring and sponsorship is absolutely critical. Cynthia's point about sponsorship is where it's at. So when we do studies across our whole industry of the women who are in the really senior roles, all of us had good mentors but equally good sponsors. So I think that's a big key. I think the other thing that will change really significantly is the way that we're looking at leadership, and that comes to your point, Jodie, because we got stuck in 1980s psychology, and we decided that, remember those presentations where they showed that tall men became presidents in America or some goofy stuff? We all tried to be taller. I don't know what we were meant to be doing. And we all wore pantsuits for a while. It was awesome to see us all in dresses today. So, but what's happening at the moment is this way we think about leadership is going away from the individual. It's not just, have you got the presence, can you speak on a stage, are you very clever and tall? It's actually about whether you can make other people stand up tall, whether you can, metaphorically of course, but you can actually impact other people. So we're not looking at a leader as an individual, we're looking at the impact on their team, on the community, on the environment around them. And I think that will be a non-gender specific leadership model, and I think it will change lots of things in a very healthy way and bring caring into the front, which is great.
Kind of a big question. I probably should have given you some time to think about it. But if you could all, each one of you, wave a magic wand and make one significant change so that in 20 years from now, when we're all sitting here with good lighting, we can say what's happened, you know, how it's moved on. What do you think, Cynthia? Is there something that you see?
Yeah, I feel really passionate about the childcare debate. Like, I think if we can just take the childcare debate off the table so that everybody has equal access to affordable and available childcare, so that when we talk about these societal issues, that the issue of arranging childcare is no longer an option. So we're miles away from that at the moment, but that would be my dream.
Elizabeth?
I think my dream would be to impact on the social norms that exist, not just in this country, but in every country in the world. And that is the norms that constrain both men and women. Because increasingly, I think men want a bigger role in caring, often than their fathers did. And the stereotype that says, no, men have to be, breadwinners, they have to be tough, they have to be this and that, is very constraining on men, just in the same way that women, as always being primary carers, is constraining on women. So I think if you were to impact on one thing, if you changed those social norms, I think a lot of the rest of it would fall into place.
Okay.
I would change the the natural bias that falls into place when we don't have information about a man or a woman. And perhaps you heard about the study that was done where exactly the same CV was given to a room of people. One was Howard, one was Heidi, and Howard would be a wonderful boss to work for, and Heidi was not a nice person at all, using a word that I can't use here. So, and I think that I was reading up more on this, and it was that when we don't know something about a person, we fall back to gender biases, and we pick out those things that we associate with being a woman or being a man. And so my dream would be that that wouldn't exist.
Okay. Rhonda?
We can do anything at all. I think what I'd change is the work-life balance, the way that we structure work debate completely, and maybe it's the nature of what I do for a living. But I think if we stop thinking of work about this 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and start to think about it balanced out, not just with family and friends, but equally with our community work, and we start to look at a portfolio way of living, I think we'll end up with different role models, and it will break those gender biases that we've talked a bit about.
Love this magic wand business. Louise?
I think I'd change girls' education. When I look at, so I only have sons, but I look at the opportunities that that our boys have had, and then I look at their friends as girls, and I feel that the education that girls get, no matter how privileged they are or otherwise, they do not leave school with the same sense of I can do anything as the boys do. And there must be something in the education system and family setup, whatever it is, but I feel it's in education to make women feel just as empowered and confident when they leave school and as they enter university and as they leave university as the blokes do.
How much of that comes from home though? I lived with my dad, and my dad used to say to me, there's two things you can't do. One of them is go to the toilet standing up, and probably don't get a job where you require strength because you've got chicken arms. But he said you can improve that if you want to. And it was really cool. And I think for me, having a man say to me, go get him, was a really empowering thing. It wasn't until years later that I recognised it, because at the time I just like, yeah, he's my dad, that's what all dads say. But you know, I just think it's really interesting where the messages come from. Men, women, teachers.
But I think this goes to the point you were
This
making
goes
earlier.
to the gender schema. And you can, if you have parents who believe that women can do anything men can do, you're on a good road to start with, I think. Because everywhere else out in the world you will come across views around constraining views for women. There also are constraining views on men though, I think. With stereotypes, gender stereotypes are not just about women, they're also about men. And I agree, it'd be fantastic to live in a world where there are no stereotypes about what men and women can and can't do. I think that would be incredibly liberating. I have to say, these social norms take a long time to change. I've just been up to Japan looking at these issues because the Abe government is very focused on lifting women's participation as part of their economic revitalisation strategy. And the social norms about who works and who cares. So for example, 60% I think of women leave the workforce when they get married. And then a lot of the rest leave on the birth of their first baby. But interestingly, if you look at the data in Japan, they have the lowest rate of women's workforce participation in the OECD and the lowest fertility rate, which is fascinating to see those two side by side, because there was a view, well, if they're not at work, they're at home reproducing. Well, that's clearly not the case. And I think that's one of the reasons Japan's very determined to lift women's workforce participation, is they also think that will lift the fertility rate as well. So.
Before I open it to the floor for questions, is there anything else that you ladies want to add? Any other point that we want to make?
Can I just add one other point?
Yep.
And it hasn't really come up in the discussion, but I do think the issue of violence against women is a really significant issue right here in our own backyard in Australia, and it takes many forms, from domestic and intimate partner violence, but also into sexual harassment in paid work. It's one of the reasons we know women leave the labour market entirely if they have an experience. And I ran a focus group recently for young women, so they were maybe 22, 23. At least 50 to 60% of them had already experienced sexual harassment in their first or second jobs. Most of them had said, well, in fact, none of them had made a formal complaint at all. They'd just packed up their bags and gone. And one of the women, she said to me, look, Liz, if my uncle does it to me, I know it's not okay, But if it's my manager or my boss, well, maybe that's just the way Australian workplaces are, and I just have to suck it up and deal with it. And I think, you know, we need to change that picture here in Australia. So, you know, we've got hard data, we've got the evidence, we need the will to want to change this picture.
I'd like to say something that's a bit trite after that, but it's just to say that I'm really pleased to have this discussion not be focusing on maternity leave, because I think that focusing on maternity leave, whether you take 3 months, 6 months or 9 months, is such a small issue compared to the 20 years that follow. It's kind of, to me, it's like focusing on the wedding and not on the marriage. You know, you'll get through the maternity leave. It's fantastic if it's supported, but that it annoys me when that is the focus of the discussion. And I feel it should be the longer term focus of how you actually manage for the full time, as opposed to just that short time.
Well, actually, I just want to make one comment that sort of brings the discussion back to the awards a bit, because one of the things we haven't really talked about is the diversity of what women are doing in Australia. So we talked a little bit about women as entrepreneurs, but Liz and I talk a lot about women in the armed forces. There is such a breadth of amazing things that women do under the banner of women in business that I think that this conversation really needs to cover all aspects of women in the community, not just corporate, which is where we've tended to spend a lot of our time today.
Okay, fantastic. Who's got some questions? Yeah, sure. I'll start down here. First arm up. Sure. I'll come to you next.
Hello, thank you so much for the discussion. Sorry, Louise, to bring it a little bit back
Sorry, can you just tell us who you are?
My name is Angela Priestley from Women's Agenda. Sorry to bring it back to maternity leave, but I will ask, it's a little bit based on a personal experience. I have just returned from maternity leave, and I can honestly say that it's the first time in my life that I feel like my career could be derailed now. It's the first time that I thought, this is really hard. You feel like you go from thriving in your career to you are surviving every day. So I wanted to ask what you think organisations, particularly larger organisations like the ones that you work for, and Jodie, would be interesting to hear about Shoes of Prey as well, could do for new mothers, particularly around breastfeeding and coping with the lack of sleep and really needing some added flexibility and a bit of extra care during that time.
Can I just clarify one thing? That I'm not in any way saying that maternity leave isn't important. Maternity leave and is absolutely crucial, but I just don't like it when the debate gets stuck there. So I'm not saying it's unimportant. And I completely agree with you that when you come back to work after you've just had a child, you actually wonder how you can so lose your confidence. And I think everybody feels the same, that first bit when you first come back to work, you can't understand what it is that's changed that's made you feel so lacking in confidence, and it's the same every time you do it. It's the same, I think.
And your brain wasn't delivered with the placenta, so that's the good news. But absolutely, it's a great point, Angela, because we did the first ever nationally representative sample of pregnancy discrimination in Australia. I released the results last month, and what that showed was that 1 in 2 women experience discrimination either when they tell the boss they're pregnant, when they go on parental leave, or when they return to work and try and negotiate a flexible work arrangement. That's in 2014, 1 in 2. And of those that experienced it, around 30% actually either left the organisation or left the labour market entirely, which brings me back to this issue around women's economic independence. So it's the most important thing you can do, I think, is to continue to be attached to the labour market on return from work. And it's up to organisations to actually put in place not just policies and procedures, because you can have the best policies in the world. If they're not implemented and the culture is not one that's inclusive of women with caring responsibilities, then your ability to stay in that organisation is going to be limited. So I think that's why I'm so excited about what Telstra's done with their All Roles Flex initiative. They've changed the starting point of work. It's no longer the ideal worker model, the 24/7, no visible caring responsibilities, and as a result of that, preferably male. They've said, no, sorry, we're done with that model. here we are, flexibility is the starting point. And when flexibility is the starting point, women with children, with very young children, can once again re-engage in a way that works both for them and for the organisation. So I think we need to watch that, see how it develops, look at the evaluation data, and if that started to become a norm, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and it's not like we don't have access to technology to enable this these days.
Well,
so there's just incredible technology to enable flexibility. And I think the other point that I'd make, Angela, on that is I think it's also incumbent upon employers to not deal with the problem the minute you come back to the office, but to start to talk to you about what your needs are and what you want when you first say that you're pregnant. Because one of the things that I've noticed is I think it works really well for women if you stay in contact with the office if you want to while you're off on parental leave, and that way when you come back it's not such a big shock that you feel like you've missed 6 months or 12 months, or in some, for some women who've taken a big career break where they've been out of the workforce for years, that sort of absence from what's happened over the last couple of years can be a real shock in terms of coming back. So putting in place a framework whereby women, if they want to, can keep in touch with what's going on in the office can really assist in coming back in that sort of re-entry strategy.
If I can add one thing, we just did an appreciative inquiry, and admittedly it's only one organisation, but what we found is the senior women, and we looked back at the cohort that they had been with in their 20s and 30s and said what happened to them. All of us have children. It was a figure of something like 76% of us had children, so that wasn't the big factor. But it wasn't how we returned from maternity leave and how long that was okay too. What it was how we on-ramp after a period of part-time. And so if someone's mentoring you now, I would say that's the one thing that big corporations and small ones could do, is when a woman goes off on mat leave, keep in touch with her, but equally mentor her that if she's back on 2, 3, 4 days a week, whatever it works for her and her family, that's still a career period. It's not this holding bay for 5 years or something like that. Because if you take 5 years out in part-time world and you've got a mindset that says, I'm just parked here for 5 years, you never catch back up.
I agree. Can I just say that I think it's incumbent upon employers not to presuppose what women want to do. Yeah. So when I had my third child, I was on maternity leave and was offered a role to relocate the family to Hong Kong. And I was so grateful that I was given that opportunity while I was on maternity leave, so I could make the decision about whether or not it worked for us and for our family, and whether or not I wanted that for my career. I think a lot of employers would assume that a woman who's on maternity leave with their third child would not want to relocate the whole family to Hong Kong and therefore wouldn't consider her for a role. So to your point, let's not assume what women want to do. Let's have the conversation with them about what their alternatives are.
And I relocated to Europe with 3 young kids, aged 0, 2 and 4. It's totally chaotic and great fun.
Yeah, it is possible. Yeah.
Good luck, Angela. It'll get better, I promise.
It will get better. This too shall pass.
Just from the perspective of a small business and starting our own, having that opportunity to really pave our own way with that, there are 2 things that I need to learn. So firstly, I don't have any children, so I don't have a personal experience to bring to it. And secondly, as I said, we've just had our first 2 women the first 2 shoes of prey babies. So I'm not sure how that operates yet. So from our point of view, I think the policies that we have in place do have a reintegration kind of idea of how that we'll keep in touch over that period that they're on maternity leave. But I think from the way that we would approach it is to ask just to ask that question of the woman, and to come to women like yourselves who are so well rounded in understanding what it is that works and doesn't work in your experiences of workplaces, to gain those learnings so that we don't make the same mistakes when we're starting something new.
And as the woman who's having the baby or on maternity leave, don't forget your voice. Have the conversation with the boss and ask and say, I can see this working for me or this not working for me. And you do lose your confidence and your mojo and you feel like you're in this fog for a period of time. Yeah, but you come out of it. And I think it's really important to make sure the conversation goes both ways, that you don't suddenly sit back and just take whatever they're going to let you take.
For sure. But I think too that just in some of my personal experiences, I don't know that it's okay to say that until someone asks and opens up that door and sort of makes that space for that conversation. So I think that as leaders, we have to be the ones approaching and making space for those conversations to happen.
There's a question up here.
My name is Martine Hart from a website called Engaging Women, and I love the idea of men in senior positions becoming role models for taking time off for some parental responsibility. I'm curious as to whether any of you have peers within your industries who are holding these senior positions where you have seen them take time off, and if so, how that has been perceived.
I've certainly seen it.
Yep.
So I've certainly seen it both with colleagues that I've worked with, but also generally, you know, when I was in investment banking, one of my clients who was the CFO of a top 50 company in Australia, he had shared caring responsibilities for his twin daughters, and so he only worked half day on Wednesday, and on Wednesday he'd go and pick the girls up, and everybody just knew that that's what he did. They knew that within his company, and if you serviced him as a client, then you knew that he was just not available on Wednesday afternoons. And the more that we can have those role models, and the more that we can have those conversations in the open, as opposed to people scurrying around picking the kids up and saying that they're at a business meeting, which happens, I think the better that it is. So yeah, and certainly at Telstra I see that quite a bit. You know, we have a lot of technology available to us that allows people to work from home, and there's an equal proportion of men and women who visibly work from home.
Gives me an idea for an interview series. Maybe we should be interviewing these men and, you know, having the discussion, making it more prominent.
Yep.
Yeah, because the question is, how do you take it out of the technology companies? Because IBM, I mean, their CEO, Glenn Boreham, worked in a flexible work arrangement. He used to work Fridays from home and whatever. He had twins. And that organisation now has 80% of a workforce in flexible work arrangement. But so the technology companies, which is essentially Telstra, IBM, they're embracing it. What we need is to take it into those male-dominated industries as well, which is, you know, to the engineering, construction, mining, utilities, where there are very few women, where they're calling out for good female talent. And I think it's about men working differently. That's what's going to create change in those organisations.
Fantastic. Any more views? Okay, another question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Jane Tasker from the Australian newspaper. A big debate in corporate Australia is on quotas on boards. So I'm just interested to see the view of some of the panel on whether they think we need quotas on boards. If so, why? And if not, why? Because I think we've talked about how far we've come in 20 years, but why we're at a point where we still need to force big businesses to have women represented on their boards?
I'm happy to kick it off. You're right, if you look at the top ASX 200, 42 boards of the top ASX 200 still have no women in 2014. So yes, we've seen a significant increase, but it's still nowhere near satisfactory. And in fact, you know, the fact is that we are making progress. The question is, would we make faster progress with quotas? I think the answer to that is yes. But having said that, the quotas are very much a one-size-fits-all. And one of the great things about the regime that's in place now around the ASX corporate governance guidelines is that the organisation themselves, who knows their business the best, sets the target and then has to transparently report against that target. My view is that quotas, I wouldn't be supportive of this year, say for example immediately. I don't think we're at a point where today we need a mandatory quota, but I absolutely think that quota needs to be part of the potential options if this momentum doesn't continue to pick up. So I think that quotas are not off the table by any means. They're absolutely on the table, but I wouldn't be in supportive of them going ahead right away. And just to give you an example of Norway, who has used quota, they've had a quota in place for 10 years. It's what they call a gender neutral quota, 40% men, 40% women, the rest's up for grabs. I was recently up in Oslo and I spoke to their gender equality minister, and they've now got quite a conservative government. And the idea was that they would possibly dismantle the quota. There's been no final decision on that, but when I was up there, that was the discussion. And I got round and I spoke to business leaders and I spoke to community organisations, and I said, look, what impact do you think dismantling the quota, the mandatory quota, would have? And the view strongly was, well, we don't think it'd have any impact at all because it's set a new normal. Actually, we're well over 40% anyway, so if the quota actually disappeared, we don't think it'd have an impact. So I think if you did go with a quota, it's what they call a temporary special measure, which needs to be in place just for the period where you're trying to realign this situation to have as many women as men on boards. So it's not ad infinitum necessarily. I don't know if
anyone else want to go into that one?
Yes, well, I find the debate about boards quite annoying. Because I actually think that it's a bit like the maternity leave versus the sort of longer caring period. Yes, boards are really important and the number of women on boards matter. But the number of women in senior executive roles is far more important than the number of women on boards. And I don't know why it's so difficult to put the spotlight onto that issue as opposed to the number of women on boards.
I think the reason for that is we've got the
Blokes
data
do
on
it.
the boards.
Yeah.
It's collected real time. I
Yeah.
can tell you from last month to this month how it's changed, whereas we don't have the data on women in senior leadership. But I absolutely agree with you.
I would vote for. I think you'd get a better outcome if we had exposed common metrics and we'd all compete to it. I mean, I've worked in minerals, building and now finance, and we look at numbers all the time. So if you don't have numbers, it doesn't matter. You've got numbers and they're clear and exposed, you'll work to them, and it doesn't need to be a quota, it just needs to be exposed numbers.
You know, I agree that, you know, I often say that which is not measured is not monitored, and so the fact that we don't have transparency of numbers with respect to women in executive positions means we need to fix that. We need to get that data.
Well, I've just had a highly technical clipboard held up with the words bye-bye written on it, so that's my cue. Who said technology hasn't moved forward? Thank you all very much for giving us your time this morning and coming along and participating in, I think, what has been a fascinating conversation listening to these ladies. And if I can please ask you to all put your hands together and thank Elizabeth Broderick, Louise Herron, Jodie Fox, Rhonda BRIGHTON-HALL and Cynthia Whelan. Thank you. Thanks, ladies. And I know I don't have to do this, but I also want to thank Telstra, because I think we don't celebrate what we do well enough. I think we're always so quick to let everybody else, do that. I think it's really important that we stand up and acknowledge what we do really well in this country, and I'm really proud of the women. I think they're amazing. They're not the ones to enter awards and sing their own praises, so yeah, glad we can do that today. As I said this morning to you outside, if you've got any more questions and you want to chat to some of these ladies, feel free to do so. But thank you very much for coming along today. Thanks. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.